Welcome to the History of Horror. I'm your host, Tom Powers, and this video series is dedicated to exploring and examining the origins of the horror film genre from way back when to present. At the start of our journey, we'll be taking a look at a short film released in 1895 titled The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. As well as featuring macabre subject matter, the short film also contains brilliant thought into costume design, special effects, and the first recorded trick of the substitution splice, used throughout cinema history in the years afterward. Welcome to the History of Horror.
He's alive! We'll tear your soul apart. Here's Johnny.
Throughout the video, I will focus on particular topics in order to paint context to the film through the lens of the horror genre. In order to fully understand the evolution of the genre, we must start at the beginning, the birth of the silver screen. While The Execution, Mary, Queen of Scots was the first horror film, the horror genre actually goes back millennia, going as far back as ancient Greece. Horror usually dealt with themes such as death, the afterlife, evil, the demonic, and the principle of the thing embodied within the person. Many popular horror icons that we know well today are derived from Greece, including witches, vampires, ghosts, and even werewolves. What we consider to be the foundations of the start of well-known horror were inspired by stories created amongst the sand and rock of the Greeks and Romans. The extremely well-known 19th century story of Frankenstein, usually credited to Mary Shelley, was actually born and greatly influenced from the tale of Hippolytus, a tragedy by Euripides, including vengeful gods, family troubles, and dark themes, including suicide. A man named Pliny the Younger, an author, lawyer, and magistrate of ancient Rome, told a tale of Athenodorus Canonites, who bought a haunted house in Athens. Athenodorus was cautious, since the house had been extremely cheap, and he wondered why. He found out the reason why soon enough. While he was writing a book on philosophy, a spectre appeared before him bound in rusty chains. He followed the figure, but it vanished into the courtyard above a specific spot. The next day, as the sun arose, the magistrates dug at the spot where it had disappeared. To their terror, they discovered an unmarked grave. While these stories to us seem tame, back then, when told around the campfire, they were the stuff of nightmares. The literary historian J.A. Cudden described the horror genre as a piece of fiction in prose of various length which is designed to frighten or shock the reader, or even reproduce a feeling of repulsion or loathing. Through time, horror has been used as a metaphor and as a means of discussing issues in the society of the day. The horror genre survived the ancients and continued into 1000 AD to give their reader an adrenaline rush. Frequently, the horror of post-1000 AD came from events happening around those times. Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler, was notorious in Wallachian history, and is often considered a national hero of Romania. During his reign of Wallachia, Vlad committed unspeakable acts upon his enemies, and by the end of his reign had killed over 80,000 people, and 20,000 of those were impaled together on pikes outside the city of Targofist. It is said that Sultan Mehmed II, after arriving at the city with his hordes and seeing the sight of the bodies twitching as crows picked at their rotting flesh, turned around and retreated. Vlad was a bloodthirsty ruler and sought out to destroy his enemies as horribly as he could, his favourite method being impaling, where a pole is inserted through a person's anus or vagina, and the pole comes out through either the head, neck, or shoulders,
leaving you to die slowly for hours upon hours in the roasting sunlight. Vlad's actions certainly spoke louder than his words, to the point where we still know him today, albeit under a different name: Dracula. Vlad's atrocities were printed on pamphlets and newspapers the world round. Sometimes the real horror is in the news itself. Jumping forward to the 18th century, Gothic horror became quite popular, and drew on the material and written history of the Middle Ages. Horace Walpole's controversial story, The Castle of Otranto, featured a love story with darker themes, and was about a woman escaping a man who wishes to marry her, with disastrous consequences. The story was cleverly disguised as a romance, but when people read it, they found it reactionary and in poor taste. But overall, most people immensely enjoyed being frightened and wanted more Gothic horror. A significant portion of the horror in the period was written by women and marketed towards a female audience, with a typical scenario involving a woman trapped in a castle, fending off attackers. The Gothic tradition soon evolved into what was called horror literature in the 19th century. Many of the stories that were written in this period are still being remade or referenced to in modern horror. Stories such as Hansel and Gretel by the Brothers Grimm, or Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Great authors such as Edgar Allan Poe and Bram Stoker ran rampant with their darker imagery in this century. The world was not only accepting horror, they were starving for it. They wanted more and more. They wanted bigger, better, scarier, and more terrifying.
It wasn't until the world of motion pictures that audiences got their wish. Not only could they read the horror, they could experience it for themselves.
Audiences got their wish in the form of The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, released in 1895 and directed by Alfred Clark. It wasn't the first film ever made, but it can be argued that it was the first horror film ever made in relation to the film's subject matter and the intent to shock and frighten an audience. The plot, if you can even call it a plot, shows a group of noblemen standing behind an executioner. Brought from off-screen, Mary comes in and kneels in front of the executioner with his axe raised. He brings down the axe onto her neck, and her head comes off. Her limp body falls to the ground as the men cheer and laugh. In the final seconds, the executioner picks up the head by the hair and faces it toward the camera.
Pretty tame, right? Well, yeah, for us. But not for audiences back then. For them, this was the real deal.
Some people fainted when they first saw it and had to be carried out of the auditorium. You have to remember that this was a year before an audience saw a train in a film coming at the screen, and they ran for cover and hid behind their seats. They thought the train would come through the screen and obliterate them all. So when audiences sat down and witnessed a woman getting her head cut off, they thought it was real, that they had just witnessed a murder. The film is set in February 1587, and so could also be considered a historical film, and also the first dramatisation to have been made. Audiences felt very strongly about Mary, Queen of Scots, and viewed her as a tragic figure, with most Catholics believing that she had a rightful heir to the throne.
More on her later.
This film is also one of the first films to use any sort of special effects or film editing, and people sitting in the theatre were shocked to be shown this subject matter. They were used to the usual dancing and performance captured by the director. It used a trick called the substitution splice, wherein just before they cut off Mary's head, they replaced her with the dummy. The film features quite an obvious cut for today's audiences, but back then it was seamless. The thing to remember is that the film was intended to shock and frighten, which it most certainly did, and so earns its place as the first stop on this journey. In order to understand how this film came to be, we must first explore the names behind it and the history on which it is based. The film was directed by Alfred Clark and produced by the Edison Manufacturing Company. The film was captured by the cinematographer and director William Heiss. The assorted actors watching Mary get beheaded are lost to time, but we do know that it was Robert L. Thomas who donned the dress and acted as Mary, Queen of Scots.
You may be asking yourself, why Mary, Queen of Scots? Why her? Why this particular event in history? Well, as I said before, the Catholics viewed her as an extremely tragic figure. Perhaps the filmmakers chose this as a vehicle to shock even more.
Mary was a descendant of Mary Tudor, herself a horror fiction legend with the alias of Bloody Mary, and a cousin to Elizabeth I. Just 6 days after being born, she was named Queen of Scotland, and at just 6 years old, held the responsibility of a nation on her head. As she was only an infant, duties of ruling were handed to regents who ruled on her behalf until she was of age. Until this time, however, Mary would be shipped off to France, where she would undergo an education in one of the most beautiful countries in the world, carefree. For now. The problem was, the one question on everybody's minds was, who is she going to marry? And this prospect and pressure hung over Mary like an axe. She found her Prince Charming in the form of Francis, King Henry II's son, and life was good for a while, until he died 1 year later, and resulted in Mary being a widow at the age of 18. After this sudden change and immense tragedy, Mary was sent back to Scotland in 1561. While her husband's death had been tragic, Mary shouldn't have had a problem with finding suitors, as she was known throughout the lands to be physically attractive and beautiful. Well, Mary eventually did find another husband, her cousin, Henry Stuart, who she said was, and I quote, the best proportioned long man she had ever seen. As well as being well proportioned, he was also known to be vain, arrogant, and a very violent drunk. Once Mary had inevitably become pregnant, Henry accused her of having an affair with his secretary, David. Henry was so furious and paranoid that in 1566 he and a group of nobles and Protestants converged upon David in front of Mary, who was by this point 6 months pregnant. Henry stabbed David 56 times in a fit of rage. Curiously, a year later, in an unfortunate series of events, Henry was killed in an explosion, leaving Mary, once again, widowed. Naturally, people talked. Rumours were spread of Mary's involvement in Henry's death, and suspicion was cast upon Mary as quick as wildfire. Although it wasn't just Mary who was being suspected, but also her close friend James Hepburn. Soon after the rumours began flying, they were both put on trial, and ultimately were both acquitted. After this ordeal, the rumours did not disappear, but transformed into stories of Hepburn's intention to be king, meaning that he may take the Queen's hand in marriage.
The question was, how would he achieve this? Would he buy her a present? Would he perform a grand gesture? Would he woo her romantically? No. Hepburn decided that instead of all that, he'd rape her. See, in those times, it was common for a man to rape a woman who he intended to marry, mostly because once he'd done it, their dignity was destroyed, and the only way they'd be able to preserve it was by marrying their rapist. Now, we don't know for sure if this is what happened, but there's an extremely strong chance that this is why she married him in 1567.
Once they were married, tensions escalated. Their marriage was extremely controversial, especially politically. Because of this, Scottish nobles rose up against her and imprisoned her within Lochleven Castle, meaning she was forced to hand over the title of ruler to her infant son. She escaped the castle in 1568 and attempted a rebellion, although this failed miserably. She soon fled to England and sought help from her cousin, Elizabeth I, although this would prove to be a fatal mistake. Elizabeth became paranoid as soon as Mary got there, fearing the Catholics that thought that Mary had a claim to the throne. To combat this, she imprisoned Mary in a tower for 18 years. In 1586, Mary was accused of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth I. Mary, Queen of Scots, was found guilty in her trial and was given the death penalty. Mary was beheaded in 1587, and some 300 years later would be adapted to a film format in order to frighten the general public of 1895.
I'm sure when Mary was being led to the chopping board, having a film made of it was the last thing on her mind.
The records say that Thomas Edison produced the film, when in actual fact it was the company, Edison Manufacturing Company, that produced it, much like Blumhouse would produce a film today. Thomas Edison is widely known to be a prolific American inventor, and perhaps the greatest inventor. He specifically furthered the areas of mass communication, electric power generation, sound recording, and most significantly for us, motion pictures. All of his inventions had a widespread effect on the modern world: the gramophone, the electric light bulb, and the motion picture camera. While all of his inventions were influential, it was his research into the camera that created the spark that led to the flame of the horror film. During its time, Edison Studios was involved in over 1,200 films, and more studios were being built all the time, some in the 1890s, some in the early 1900s, and another one in 1907. Edison didn't personally have any involvement in the films. It was more his assistant, William K. Dixon, who oversaw most of the film's productions from 1893 to 95, meaning that it would have been Dixon that oversaw the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. The very first commercially available films were from Edison Studios and were screened at a kinetoscope parlor in New York in 1894. The program consisted of 10 short films, all less than 10 seconds long, and consisted of dancers, performers, and athletes. The earliest productions from Edison Studios were brief actualities, real-life events such as fire calls, and were essentially small documentaries. Although this small empire wouldn't last for long, as the British and French industries were creating competition. So by 1904, 85% of Edison's films had a definitive narrative to stand out. Edison was so protective of his film empire that he created a trust of a select few producers in order to protect the industry and keep outsiders away. He named this the Motion Picture Patents Company and was designed to dominate the market. Eventually, though, like all empires, it came to an end after they were ruled out and broken up by the federal courts under monopoly laws, and also by the loss of the European markets during World War I. This event hurt him financially and emotionally, and he was forced to sell the business in 1918. During their time, Edison Studios created some well-known films, such as The Great Train Robbery from 1903, Alice in Wonderland and Frankenstein both in 1910, and another film titled The Land Before the Sunset in 1912. This film being notable as William K. Everson, a film historian, was quoted as saying that this was, quote, the first genuinely lyrical film. Everson, while calling Edison Studios, quote, financially successful and artistically unambitious, and other than directors such as Edwin S. Porter and John Hancock Collins, quote, the Edison Studios never turned out a notable director, or even one above average, nor did the Edison films show the sense of dynamic progress that one gets from studying the Biograph films on a year-by-year basis. On the contrary, there is a sense of stagnation.
Quite a scathing review. Throughout this series, we will look at specific cast and crew members to try and figure out where this film came from. There is always an interesting story when you dig a little deeper.
According to Letterboxd.com, the director Alfred Clark made only one film, being this one. He was a British-American pioneer of music recording and cinema. From an early age, and especially when he turned 16, he developed an interest in electricity and left college to work for the North American Phonograph Company. This eventually collapsed in 1894, where he would cross paths with Edison, and started working for the Edison Company, where he made several short films without being credited. His films usually involved special effects, trained actors, continuity and plot, something which was quite revolutionary for the time. After he spent his time at the Edison Company, he left to join Emile Berlinger's Gramophone Company, who today manage companies like HMV, a popular media shop in the UK. He was naturalised as a British citizen in 1928 and, strangely, became a leading member of an original ceramic society in London until he died in 1950. As the film that we are looking at was made over 100 years ago, information on the story behind the film is sparse, but we are able to establish a brief timeline of when and how the film was made. Unfortunately, we may never know for sure why the film was made. William Heiss, the cinematographer of The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was credited for more than 175 short films, and is probably most well known for his film The Kiss in 1896, one of the first films to be shown commercially to the public, and consisted of an 18-second kiss between May Irwin and John Rice from the final scene of the stage musical, The Widow Jones. Not much is known about the actor Robert Thomas either. The only film he ever acted in was this one, and all we know is that he plays the role of Mary. What stands out in this film is the level of special effects seen in such a short time frame. When Mary is brought to the block and the primitive form of the stop trick or substitution splice is used, the effect is used to achieve a form of appearance, disappearance, or transformation by altering one or more of the selected aspects of the frame in the background between two shots, while maintaining the same frame and shot. The pioneer filmmaker Georges Méliès claimed to have accidentally discovered this process in one of his films, saying that, quote, "An obstruction of the apparatus that I used in the beginning, a rudimentary apparatus in which the film would often tear or get stuck and refuse to advance, produced an unexpected effect. One day, when I was prosaically filming the Place de l'Opéra, I had to stop for a minute to free the film and to get the machine going again. During this time, passers-by, omnibuses, cars had all changed places, of course. When I later projected the film, reattached at the point of the rupture, I suddenly saw the Madeleine Bastille bus changed into a hearse, and men changed into women. The trick by substitution, called the stop trick, had been invented, and 2 days later, I performed the first metamorphosis of men into women, and the first sudden disappearances that had, at the beginning, such a great success." But according to the film scholar Jacques Deslandes, it is more likely that Méliès closely examined the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Although he wasn't the first to invent it, he certainly was the first to perfect it. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, is a short film, and so is quick to analyse and digest. The footage is reasonably shaky, so we could assume that the film was filmed by hand or on some sort of rudimentary tripod. What is immediately noticeable is the attention to costume design. The outfits have been carefully picked out or created by someone, we don't know who. Perhaps they were borrowed from another play or film the Edison company had produced previously. You can quite clearly see the cut when Mary's head is cut off, and while primitive, it's hard not to appreciate the craftsmanship. This film walked so others could run. When audience members witnessed this, some of them fainted, so for them it was real. The film is historically accurate as well. At the end, the executioner holds up her head to the audience in a grotesque fashion.
Back in 1568, the real executioner held up Mary's head and shouted to the crowd, "God save Queen Elizabeth. May all the enemies of the true evangel thus perish." There are questions that are left unanswered. Why make this film? Why this specific historical event? We may never know. Unfortunately, that secret is lost to time. Perhaps Alfred Clark and co. picked up a history book and chose the first macabre thing they found and thought, yes, this is the one, we'll make a film out of this one. Or perhaps they came up with the idea of a beheading first and then trawled through the history books trying to find a famous figure that was beheaded so they could have someone get beheaded. While tame today, the short film The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots really frightened audiences. They thought it was real. They thought they had witnessed a murder. Imagine watching a film like Videodrome or American Werewolf in London or The Thing and truly believing that what you are seeing is real. Imagine going back in time and showing someone Audition or something like that, or Saw, to an audience member from 1895. They'd be absolutely terrified. So we have to put ourselves in their shoes and really think, man, they would have been scared when they saw this. While tame today, The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots was a hit. And to the audiences, unbeknownst sitting in that theatre, the horror film had just been born. Thank you so much for watching. This is the first video I've done in a while, and this is a project I wanted to do for a long time. Originally it was going to be a podcast, and I was going to do it as, essays and reviews, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to make videos. I'm going to do it like this because, I've got a degree in film production. I should be able to edit together a video. I also love horror films, and I want to do the research. I want to find out more and take the journey with you. So, please tune in next week for 1896's The Haunted Castle by Georges Méliès. It's going to be a fun one. If you would like to keep up to date with me, I have the socials. They're in the description below. If you'd like to follow my Instagram, that's in there. If you'd like to follow me on Instagram, the handle is Dr. Horror Reviews. There are reviews of horror films that I do on there. I watch them all the time. So take a read if you like. And there'll also be updates on the next video and that sort of thing. I'm going to try and upload videos weekly, depending on how much I'm working, etc. But I really want to keep going with this. So please like, comment, show me your appreciation, tell me what I'm doing wrong, tell me what you want to see in the future when there's more films to choose from. We can do polls on what film you'd like to see for that year. You know, the 80s is going to be a tough one because who knows? You know, 1982, I really want to do The Thing because that's my favourite horror film, but there's so many other films that I want to do in the 80s. So when I finish and I get up to present day, I may go back and do video essays on some of my favourite ones that I didn't cover in the Evolution of Horror series. But that's for very far in the future. But please continue watching if you enjoyed the content. I'd really love to hear your feedback. Goodbye. See you next time.